Do we need decarbonized gases in the future? Absolutely yes, because we want to become carbon neutral.
It promotes the carbon circular economy and facilitates the energy transition by integrating more renewables into the energy system.
Gas remains beneficial to European society. It's the low-hanging fruit to not leave anyone behind.
And it allows every sector of this economy to switch to decarbonized energy.
Especially in decarbonizing homes and businesses in Europe's rural and off-grid areas. And to this purpose, we need to cherish and nurture gas-efficient appliances.
And this is how we can get the Green Deal done.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by Eurogas on decarbonized and renewable gases. It's an event being hosted in the context of EU Sustainable Energy Week, which this year is spread out over a number of weeks, has gone digital, and is dedicated to clean energy for green recovery and growth. So it's a pleasure to see so many of you this morning. We had just over 300 people registered as we kicked off today. And I guess the basis for today's discussion is a new study that was commissioned by Eurogas just over a year ago. DNVGL has basically done a piece of work looking at how the gas sector could decarbonize between now and 2050. I should say that what we're going to hear today are preliminary results, so they're a teaser, a taster, if you like, of what's to come. The full study will be out at the end of the month, so that's on the 30th of June. Purely on practicalities, so our speakers will switch on their microphones and mics as they take the floor. All participants are muted, so you don't need to worry if you're having cups of tea, if you have children in the background, cats running around, etc. The webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to re-watch it at a later stage if you wish. And finally, you can obviously send in questions. We'll take some questions immediately after the keynote presentation from DNVGL about the study, and then there should be another 15 minutes or so for questions at the end once we've heard from the whole panel. So the way to ask questions is simply to type them into the questions box, and they'll pop up on my screen, and I'll try and take as many questions as I can. When you're writing in your question, it'll ask you who you are, so please do enter your name. Please do also tell me your organization, since there's over 150 of you, and I see have already logged on, and I'm inevitably not going to know where you're coming from otherwise. So with that, let's move straight on to our presentation. I'd like to welcome Warner ten Kate. He's a senior consultant at DNVGL, more than 10 years of experience in international energy policy and working on gas market regulation in particular. Go ahead, Warner.
Thank you, Sonja. Thank you all for being here. As Sonja said, I'm a consultant with DNVGL. We are a major provider of services to the oil and gas sector, but also the renewable sector. And we are commissioned by the Eurogas, the Association of European Gas Industries, to look into a future for gas. And to do this, next slide, please. We were asked to model two scenarios through our proprietary energy transition outlook model that we publish yearly, and that sets a course for our company into where the future of energy is heading. And the Eurogas asked us to look into what kind of options would that offer for the gas sector, but also what kind of costs would be associated to such a future. To do this, we developed two scenarios. One we dubbed the Eurogas 2019 scenario, and the other one is a 1.5 tech scenario, which is loosely modeled after the Commission's scenario published in 2018 that developed a view to a fully decarbonized energy system in 2050. Both scenarios achieve a full decarbonization into 2050. Main differentiator between the two scenarios is that for the Eurogas scenario, we modeled a carbon price steadily rising to 100 euros per ton in 2050, and the 1.5 tech scenario has, like the original 1.5 tech scenario, a carbon price of 350 euros per ton in 2050. In the Eurogas scenario, we closely looked at what kind of options are there available for gas, natural gas, to be decarbonized in 2050. What kind of options are there? Mainly 4 options were discussed: biomethane, hydrogen production through electrolysis, hydrogen production through decarbonized methane reforming, and then decarbonize the use of gas entirely through CCS. And for the 1.5 tech scenario, we looked into a more support of electrification options in the various energy consumption sectors. To the right bottom, we see there the sort of ultimate outcomes for both sectors, which tells the narrative. The narrative of being that both scenarios see a dramatic increase in the electrification, more so in the 1.5 tech scenario, but also in the Eurogas scenario. And both still see a considerable use of natural or decarbonized gas use in the future, but more so to an extent in the Eurogas scenario than in the 1.5 tech scenario. Next slide, please. As said, both scenarios achieve full decarbonization in 2050. That's net zero, if you'd like. And achieve the Green Deal objective as announced last year by the EC Commission, which means that we look now at 55% decarbonization in 2030 as the ultimate objective for 2030. In the dark blue line, you see our own model of the future in 2019, which did not achieve any of the Paris, did see a notable decarbonization, but did not achieve the Paris Climate Agreement objectives. And therefore, this is interesting as what is extra needed to achieve these objectives into the future. Naturally, both scenarios see a reduction in primary energy supply. I've shown him here as non-fossil, nuclear, and fossil. Both see that through an increased uptake of electricity, as that particularly in the transport sector results in quite significant efficiencies. It is notable that for the 1.5 tech scenario, we see that very renewable energy sources, wind and solar particularly, achieve 50% of the electricity mix in 2032, and the Eurogas scenario also achieves 50% of VRES, but then 6 years later in 2038. Next slide, please. Naturally, primary energy supply is not why we are here today. We're discussing sectoral energy demand, particularly in manufacturing and in building sectors, and to highlight the dynamics underlying these demands, I've shown the graph below. Once again, for electrification is still a main driver for increase in efficiency and the need for energy in the various sectors. However, what is notable in the 1.5 tech scenario is that there's still an increase in what we've dubbed the other energy consumption, which is mostly related to energy sector own use. And because the 1.5 tech scenario uses a lot more networks to get electricity to consumers, you see that the losses associated increase as well. Eurogas scenario naturally has less, but still a quite significant buildup of transportation capacity, but sees that effect to a lesser extent. And what we also see is that naturally the electricity generation consumption is lower in 1.5 tech, as we did not model ambient heat or wind energy input as such. We see that the transport sector dynamics are roughly the same across both scenarios, as is manufacturing. The internal dynamics are different, and the building sector sees a notable decline in the 1.5 tech scenario. So what does that deliver us with result to the decarbonization of each individual sector? The 1.5 tech scenario we modeled both scenarios actually depend on net negative emissions from sectors to redistribute those gains to other sectors. However, this is most notable in the Eurogas scenario as electricity generation, particularly through the use of biomethane, biomass, and CCS, delivers a substantial amount of negative emissions that then offsets notable unabated emissions, particularly in the transport and building sector. So these are, you know, the Eurogas scenario as such is more dependent on the the various sectors offsetting each other, whilst the 1.5 tech scenario has more decarbonization within the sector. Next slide, please. Then focusing on the manufacturing and the building sector. The manufacturing sector sees energy demand decline roughly along the same lines. However, the electricity uptake in the 1.5 tech sector is considerably higher, delivering more technical alternatives to current natural gas use. But that also delivers some disadvantages with regard to the network buildup that is needed to provide that electricity to sectors. Overall, we see that in the Eurogas scenario, the manufacturing sector achieves a net negative or an emission intensity that is far lower than the 1.5 tech scenario, and that's particularly because of the use of hydrogen in the initial phase, produced through reforming and CCS, but in a later stage is considerably outcompeted by electrification and electrolysis of hydrogen. This will also result in less infra costs, and particularly also that subsequently related lower costs to consumers in the manufacturing sector. We forecast that over the forecasted period, so up until 2050, on average, the fuel costs for the manufacturing are 12% lower in the Eurogas scenario than they are in 1.5 tech. Then with regard to the building sector, well, this is arguably in our model, but I think also in Europe, the most difficult sector to decarbonize from the current situation. We saw that to achieve the electrification objectives in the 1.5 tech scenario, we needed to apply a considerable amount of incentive to decarbonize, particularly in the intermediate period from now until 2030. Which you can also see in the graphs below. However, that does result in a net negative or in carbon emission intensity for the building sector that is far lower. However, the less retrofit and does also mean that the Eurogas, as on the flip side of the coin, is a lot less costly to achieve decarbonization in that sector than for the 1.5 tech scenario. Particular reason is there because we see that a lot of the seasonal demand fluctuations are now transferred to the electricity sector, and as such, a considerable capacity buildup in the power grid is needed to accommodate for these fluctuations. Whilst in the Eurogas scenario, we see that the requirement, the capacity available or needed to supply seasonal flexibility is actually is less than the current situation. So therefore delivers less overcapacity to be less capacity to be present to supply that amount of energy. So next slide, please. So what does that mean for the natural gas supply into these sectors? As mentioned, we modeled 4 decarbonized options. We've modeled reform with CCS to produce hydrogen, electrolysis, biomethane, and then as a final measure, we have CCS present to decarbonize natural gas use in the power sector and manufacturing sector. And both scenarios see that decarbonized gases overtake traditional natural gas use in the sector. The Eurogas scenario has still a bit of an increase over the forecasted period of roughly 15%. And there, that delivers roughly a energy, but still delivers an energy system that is decarbonized until up to a certain percent of roughly 90% if you would have a similar system supplying natural gas as is. If we subsequently add net negative emissions from biomethane use in the power sector, we would even fully decarbonize the energy system or the natural gas supply system. Then how does the demand for decarbonized gases evolve? We see that particularly the manufacturing and building sector drive demand for decarbonized gas. Initially, manufacturing taking the lead in the medium term, but in the later term, natural gas use in the building sector being replaced by decarbonized hydrogen. Next slide, please. Both scenarios then do depend on a subsequent buildup of CCS capacity, and we do cost modeling. So at a certain point in the model, a certain cost level is achieved whereby CCS we think is viable. Overall, this cost level is roughly between 100 and 110 euros per ton. We see that both scenarios actually need a considerable buildup of CCS capacity to achieve the decarbonization target. So it's not necessarily only the Eurogas scenario that does that. We did check whether such capacity would be available by looking at the IOGP availability, also under restricted conditions, and both see that these are not breached within the time frame. But as a point, it might also be noted that this is cost level. So if there is cheaper carbon capture and utilization options available, these might significantly contribute to these uptakes. However, for the overall picture, we were asked to, next slide please, to look into what such a future would cost. And we found that continue to use the natural gas system as in place delivers significant cost advantages to the Eurogas scenario, and these are in the amount of 130 billion euros per ton, or not per ton, per year over the forecasted period. And that's particularly because the building sector is notoriously hard to decarbonize and requires a considerable amount of investment, particularly in the 2018 to 2030 period, of around 10 trillion euros to persuade customers to not to actively swap out their current system and replace that for an electrified alternative. This means that for the overall infrastructure cost, we see that there's a less requirement of capex expenditure on electricity grids of around 1.3 trillion euros, whilst naturally the natural gas or the decarbonized gas system in 2050 needs capex as well, but these are then mostly related to the retrofit or the adaptation of natural gas systems to accept the amount of hydrogen into the system. So these are the high-over results we present to you today. As Sonia already mentioned, the final report and results will become available at the end of the next month. And thank you for any of your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Warner. Indeed, we have some time for questions before we go to our panel. So you can send in your questions via the questions tab on the right. Just type them in and tell us who you are, your name and your organization, and Warner will do his best to answer them. Maybe Warner, to kick us off and to recap a little bit, come back to the beginning of what you said. So the basic difference between the 1.5 tech scenario, which is one of the Commission's net zero scenarios, and the scenario you've modeled now on behalf of Eurogas is, so you see your scenario includes more, they both hit all the decarbonization targets, but you basically have more gas and lower cost overall. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. For us, the question is, like, how do you get from A to B? And we tried on a high level to remodel the 1.5 tech using a different model, but at a sectoral level, show the same energy uptake as would be the 1.5 tech. We needed incentives in the model to provide the 1.5 tech outcome, and at the same time for the Eurogas model we would have to also need some incentives to either continue, well, not to continue gas use, but to transfer the system in such. These costs are then compared to each other. What kind of options do you forgo? There's costs associated to that as well. What do you include? What benefits are there? And you know that then delivers a net cost outcome for an energy future system.
Okay. So we have a number of questions that have come in. Two of those relate to CCS, so maybe we can pick up on those right away. One is from John Williams at AFRI. Do you consider the availability of CCS will be limited to certain countries, or that it will be available in most of the EU? And what assumptions have you made about the development of a CO2 transport network? Let's start with that one.
So we to check whether the amount of underground storage capacity available, we did that, and we did that on a restricted policy basis. So we have an overall availability in the EU, and then subsequently said, okay, this is, you know, well, not unachievable, but that would be unrealistic to have that entirely available to the market. So we did restrict that. Second question was, and then.
So you assumed that it wouldn't necessarily be available in all EU countries.
No, the model does not work with specific EU countries, but we did assume that a considerable amount was not available.
Okay. The second question was on the CO2 transport network.
Yeah, the model works. The model provides us with costs related to CCS, roughly along the lines of 70% is the part that is capture, the 20% is transport, and 10% is storage. And that cost total would give you a competitiveness picture for CCS in the existing EU energy mix. Subsequently, over the time frame, there is learning applied to these costs. So the learning comes down as long as you build up, you learn on how to use such capacity. Naturally, these costs will all be provided in the report, but that then provides us with a costing, and I must also, as a disclaimer, say that we only applied learning for the capture part of the technology, because we consider transport and storage as well established. It is a practice that's been done, and we know how it works.
Okay, so it's basically
limited.
Cost-based perspective. Yeah. Okay. So then again on CCS, the CCS for the power sector is much greater than CCS for manufacturing and hydrogen production. And that's the case all the way through until 2050. This is from Anne-Mette Jorgensen, I should add. Why is that the case, and what did you assume with regard to renewables, renewable energy deployment? So there's this large chunk of CCS in the power sector. Where does that come from?
Well, most of that, firstly, we assume that in the power sector, basically all fossil or biomass use for power sector is being CCS. That is a necessity in both the scenarios to achieve full decarbonization. Sorry, with regard to renewables, we see.
Yeah, I think that's also the assumption. So because there's a lot of CCS in the power sector, that part of the power supply is not being run on renewables. So that's kind of a follow-up question. You have a big part of CCS. Most of the CCS is in the power sector, i.e. that sector, that part of power production is not running on wind or solar, clearly.
No, but it for in the overall picture for the power sector, we see that well, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, so let's say mid 2030, more than half of that is VRES, and that will continue to grow. But still, we need a certain amount of either backup, but also because certain amount of the power sector is run on biomass or biomethane, you would still like to have to use the CCS capabilities to deliver net negative emissions that then can offset other sectors.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question fully.
I think it's as far as possible, yeah. We have 2 questions then from Siobhan Hall at Platts. Both of them relating to what will drive the take-up of hydrogen. One, the CO2 price, how does that need to evolve in the short term to drive the take-up of hydrogen?
Well, in the short term, the carbon price particularly incentivizes CCS uptake, and therefore that's one of the major reasons why we see blue hydrogen, as it's always frequently referred to take up faster. So that is a major driver. Beyond 2030, the availability of substantial amounts of VRES then drive, so decreasing costs of electricity then drive electrolysis as the main source of hydrogen. And the competitive scenario, the competitiveness between the two is that in 2050 we forecast that the cost of a megawatt hour of hydrogen through electricity to electrolysis is in cost is roughly a quarter of what it is in using reforming in CCS.
Okay, and in terms of what the CO2 price actually needs to be, how high does it need to be in the short term to kick off the hydrogen, the production and use of hydrogen? Do you have figures for that?
I have no figures on the top of my head, but we'll make one available in the we'll make them available in the report.
Okay, and yeah, her other question was indeed that the most effective policy incentives to increase demand for clean hydrogen. Is there anything you can add to that, increasing on the demand side?
Well, for decarbonized hydrogen to become available in through the network to consumers, we looked at, on the one hand, the appliances that could use hydrogen, and what level of technical maturity they were, and on the other hand, what kind of costs would relate to change over the network so it could accept increasing volumes of hydrogen. Both were remarkably small, even though we used fairly conservative numbers. I mean, there are a lot of numbers out there. So, for example, if we would like to blend hydrogen into the existing network, which would be in the intermediate period being a fairly cost competitive option, their cost ranges out there of between 5 and 25% of an original capex for such a network to retrofit it, and we as a conservative estimate to 20% of that, but that still allowed us to deliver decarbonized hydrogen fairly cheaply to consumers. Subsequently, the question is, okay, can consumers use that hydrogen in their current appliances? We did not see a big risk there. There are certain household appliances that definitely do need to have their valves and such checked. But we also saw that in the longer term, hydrogen boilers would become for 100% hydrogen use would become available at cost competitive levels.
Yeah.
So both from the use and the supply part through the network, we saw no real significant, or costs were not prohibitive as we would have expected initially.
Okay. I have more questions, but we're going to take a final one at this stage. And you have touched on some of the others, which were around how ready is gas infrastructure to handle these clean gases. So you've touched on that, I think, a little. The final question, then we go to the panel, and we'll come back to questions after the panel, is from, let's take Geert de Kok from Transport and Environment. Why exclude gaseous and liquid fuels for shipping and aviation from your analysis? Because they at T&E see large demand for these new kinds of low carbon or decarbonized liquid fuels, particular to the decarbonized long distance transports.
Yeah, thank you. That's a point that I might want to clarify here. We did include the full transport sector, so including aviation, rail, and shipping. However, the asterisks, in the graphs mentioned, is that we've, for this particular exercise, only modeled the transport need in the EU. So inter-EU travel, both from aviation, shipping, and rail, is included, also road, of course. And we see there that there is that particularly for the aviation sector, there's there's still a considerable oil use, kerosene, but there's a large shift towards biofuels, liquid biofuels, and in the maritime sector there's a considerable uptake of natural gas that does not necessarily deliver the decarbonization as much as you need, but there's also considerable uptake of hydrogen, and particularly hydrogen bound through ammonia, as a carrier for the maritime sector.
Okay, but you didn't look further at converting the hydrogen, power to liquid, power to gas, power to liquid, so actually creating these alternative low carbon.
In our model, we did in model we did not have e-liquids as such, because it's at that moment that we started, we thought that was too cost prohibitive at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Warner. We'll give you a break. Warner is still going to be on the line, so if you have further questions for him, please feel free to send those through, and I'll keep an eye on. I know there's been one or two others that have come in the meantime as well. We'll try and pick up on those a little later. I'd like to go to the panel then. So we have 7 panelists. So I'm going to remind our panel, please do your best to stick to 5-6 minutes for your interventions. We'll hear from all of you, and then we'll take questions after that. So first of all, we'll turn to the European Commission, Augustijn van Hasteren, team leader for sector coupling at DG Energy. So he's been working on energy markets at the Commission since the early 2000s, previously electricity market design, and nowadays on how to decarbonize gas going forward. So Augustijn, if you want to switch on your camera and mic and give us, I think what everyone's looking forward to hearing is, well, an update on where we stand with the famous sector integration strategy that we're expecting in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody, and also thank you for inviting me for this event. In a way which is we all get adapted to. It's, I think, the first time I put on a tie for a video conference, so I hope you appreciate that. So let me say you a few words shortly about where we stand, but first where we come from. It's well known to everybody that the thinking of the Commission when it came to decarbonization really accelerated once we published the long-term strategy. Our, meanwhile, not so new president anymore made promises to the European Parliament as to what our ambitions were going to be for 2050, but also for 2030, meaning that the 1.5 tax scenario, which was one of the scenarios in long-term strategy, became the one which is probably most closest to the one which we would have to follow, and it has been commented on already in the presentation. I think it was a very useful presentation. And now the Commission is thinking around the issue as to if we have this ambition, how we're going to make sure that we actually going to get there. What are the concrete steps which we need to take? Evidently this is a debate which is still ongoing, and which I'm as eager to find out the precise landing zone as anybody else outside. But the best I can do is to tell you what the various steps are and frame a little bit, to provide you some insights in the debate which has been taking place. So first of all, I think it's important to note that by the climate law, of course, it has been announced that specific measures in order to remain on a trajectory will be proposed by mid next year. June 2021 has been the date. And of course, this has also relates to questions as to what kind of instruments we're going to use in order to decarbonize and to reach the increased ambition by 2030 and to remain on the pathway for 2050. And that has to do, I mean, in the climate law and in the Green Deal communication, a number of instruments has already been mentioned. The question, of course, is out still, which we're going to use. And that debate will be taking place on the basis of a communication for which we aim to publish in September, where we will provide more transparency as to what instruments will be used and what sectors will be prioritized in terms of decarbonization measures. Having said that, it's also clear that in general terms, we have to rethink a little bit on our energy policy. It used to be very much based on a silo-based approach, gas, electricity, and evidently, yes, of course, there are connections, but it is probably necessary to think about it in a more holistic way to make sure that the synergies which exist between various energy carrier markets are fully exploited, but also in view of the fact that we are decarbonizing, to think about it in a holistic way, which also includes the end user sectors. As already mentioned before, we are looking to a world where, for instance, more hydrogen is being used. And my standard example to demonstrate this has become that if we want to introduce hydrogen, we have to have really a value chain approach. There's little point in producing hydrogen for which nobody has a usage. And therefore, we also have to include very much the whole value chain, including the demand side, in terms in order to have a real impact as to what we want to achieve. So this vision as to how we want to think about energy policy is made more concrete now in two communications, which indeed we plan to publish in the next few weeks. One of them is the energy sector integration, which deals with themes around, let's say, how we're going to make the energy system more circular, how are we going to deliver on the ambition for more deeper electrification of the economy, and also really for those sectors where electrification is not possible, how are we going to make this happen. So there will be a strong emphasis on circular aspect of the energy sector electrification, whereas in situations where sectors are really hard to decarbonize, like industry, heavy-duty transportation, maritime and transportation, of course, we have to look to different kind of fuels, and these are most likely to be hydrogen or hydrogen-based kind of fuels. Evidently, it doesn't mean that we completely forget about the traditional gas sector. I think it's probably necessary also to review the gas sector legislation as such, to see what the barriers are for renewable gases to come to the market, and to see how we can facilitate that in the longer run. The other communication relates to hydrogen. This is a much debated topic. and where in fact this, in particular this value chain approach, for the reasons I already elaborated on earlier, is really important. So, and where also more clarity needs to be created as to what the pathway would be. So in the communication, we hope to be able to shed more light on the kind of, let's say, the roadmap which we foresee for the deployment of hydrogen, where we would like to create as much clarity as possible as to how much hydrogen we see by what dates, and what the development path would be for the deployment of hydrogen, and including pointing to a number of measures we think are probably necessary in order to make that happen. The communication is wider in scope to some extent as this energy sector integration strategy, because we also need to deal with not just market development and incentivization, but also with R&D, the international aspects, and let's say how we're going to make sure that renewable hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen is really that, as opposed to any kind of hydrogen. This is a very short intervention. I realize there are many details to be elaborated upon, but I understand that we have to give some space also to other speakers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Auke Stein. Yes, lots of potential follow-up questions. We'll save those for the end in the interest of the other panelists, in the interest of time. But thank you for that update on what's to come from the Commission's perspective. We'll turn then next to Andreas Graf, Project Manager for EU Energy Policy at Agora Energiewende, so the Berlin-based think tank devoted to the energy transition. And you've been doing a lot of work recently also around the decarbonization of industry, which, as we just saw in Warner's presentation, industry, manufacturing, buildings, really the two key sectors his work suggests for the future of hydrogen. So what does your work tell you about the role of hydrogen and, well, in the decarbonization of industry? Go ahead.
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, you can hear me? Good. Yes, so in the last couple of years, Agora has been working intensely to go beyond our original focus on the power sector and energy transition in that sector to look at heavy industry, in particular in the context of a study for Germany that was released at the end of last year, looking at how to achieve a climate neutral Germany in industry. And so what we especially did was look at what technologies and policies would be needed to put us on track to meeting Germany's 2030 industry sector targets, as well as keep us on track to actually becoming climate neutral by 2050. So why is this important? 3 reasons. Industry is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. In Europe, it's around 20% of EU CO2 emissions. In Germany, that 60% of that fifth of emissions is just 3 sectors: steel, cement, and basic chemicals, and that was the main focus of our study. At the same time, if you look at how industry emissions have been evolving over the years, we can see that based on the sectoral targets that were set in Germany, there were in 2018 still 56 million tons of CO2 that needed to be reduced to meet the 2030 targets, whereas industrial emissions had flatlined and potentially even been slightly rising before the pandemic. So the second reason is we are only one investment cycle away from 2050. These are very long-lived assets. A blast furnace can last 50 years, steam cracker 50 to 70 years, cement kiln also around that range. So what that means is that we are only one investment cycle away from 2050. That is, of course, something that needs to be taken into account when looking at how to achieve a climate neutrality. At the same time, we have major reinvestment needs in Germany in the coming decade. We've estimated that in steel, it's roughly 53% of capacity, for chemicals, 59%. And these are key sectors for decarbonization, especially with hydrogen. Third, there are many jobs affected. We have nearly 300,000 employees in Germany in these sectors alone. and existing industrial processes will have to be fundamentally transformed for us to achieve climate neutrality in these industrial sectors. If we want that transformation to take place in those established companies and sites, this will require a rapid phase-in of new technologies, and we need to create that market and business case as soon as possible. So the good news is our study shows the technologies exist. We identified a range of technologies for all three sectors that would allow us to achieve our climate neutral goals. For steel and chemicals, as I mentioned, there are both CCS and hydrogen options, but hydrogen is perhaps the more interesting carrier and option. For cement, there are a range of options, CCS being perhaps slightly favored, but also alternative materials, binders, direct electrification perhaps in the distant future. So what's the bad news? The bad news is the scale of electricity production that would be needed is quite breathtaking. So there will need to be a considerable effort to actually scale the electricity needed for direct electrification in these sectors, but as well for the indirect electrification of producing hydrogen. Just to give you a sense of scale, current electricity production in Europe is around 3,000 terawatt hours. That could be industrial electricity demand in 2050, based on Eurelectric's scenarios. Secondly, there's currently not a business case for most of these technologies. We can't expect the market to deliver them on their own. Just to give you a sense of kind of what we're talking about relative to a kind of a benchmark technology of a coal-based blast furnace steel production, a kind of the relative CO2 price you would need for a DRI-based green steel production would be 99 to 165 tons of CO2. You could probably bring that down by first starting with a direct reduction with natural gas and green electricity through electric arc furnace, which would achieve considerable reductions and could transfer to hydrogen in the future. Then you'd be about 50 to 70 tons of CO2 based on our calculations. Now, some people might say that our assessments, our cost assumptions are conservative, but considering that we are talking about quick phase-in the next decade, we chose to use slightly more conservative figures, which seemed more appropriate at this point in time. So, three things we think need to happen broadly in the European Green Deal to make this happen are to focus on three specific issues. First, we need to prioritize circular economy as much as possible. And I want to really underline this point because circular economy is insufficient on its own for us to reach climate neutrality, but it is a major lever for us to actually have to do less on hydrogen and less on CCS, and to actually be in a much better position to actually deliver on our climate neutrality in industry. Secondly, we need to create a strong business case for the commercialization of these breakthrough technologies. I think the hydrogen strategy, both on EU and German level, are an important first step here, but we need to create concrete instruments to actually deliver that business case, and that will mean supply push instruments like carbon contracts for difference, demand pull instruments like quotas for green products, but also a robust carbon leakage mechanism so that there is a strong, also safe business case for kind of unlevel playing field globally. Finally, we need to really invest in the kind of priority infrastructure and strategic feedstocks that we will need to actually make these technologies deliver. And that in particular means hydrogen and CCS infrastructure. In Europe, that will also mean taking into account cross-border infrastructure needs. But there are, a lot of questions here to also still be addressed and I hope the hydrogen strategy and the sector integration strategy take us one step closer. So I think just to wrap up, I think we've heard some announcements now with the Clean Hydrogen Alliance, and the Commission will come forward with some further proposals. The German hydrogen strategy that will be released likely tomorrow or be adopted by the German cabinet tomorrow is another important signal that steers us in the right direction. But we have a lot of homework still to do and a lot of discussions still to have on EU level.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for giving us, I think, a very concise, very clear summary of why industry is so important, what the options are, and what needs to happen in particular from the policy side to move forward the decarbonization agenda there. Once again, you can send to participants, you can send in questions via the questions tab on the right, and we'll save those for the end of the panel. So thank you once again, Andreas. We go then from industry to buildings, the second sector that Warner highlighted in his presentation this morning as key to developing a clean hydrogen economy. I'd like to welcome Monique Goyens, Director General at BEUC, so representing European consumers, 45 national consumer associations, no less. And I think the question to you is, well, in your experience, how do people see the energy transition in buildings, and even more importantly, are they prepared to pay for a transition of some sorts?
Yes, thank you for having invited me. I have to confess immediately, of course, I'm a consumer advocate. I'm not a specialist in gas and certainly even less in renewable gas. But I think it is a very good idea to invite consumers to this webinar, because consumers are willing to engage into the energy transition. That's sure. All the Eurobarometers are very clear on that. And what I would even like to say, and Agustin also mentioned it a few minutes ago, it is crucial to engage consumers. If you don't engage consumers into the energy transition, you will miss the target of mitigating the climate crisis. We need to change our lifestyles. We need to change the way we eat, the way we travel, the way we move, the way we heat or cool our houses, the way we buy and use and reuse and recycle products, the way we buy clothes. So it is really key to engage consumers and to make them participate in the conversation. So what I would like to say today, also in a few minutes only, first of all, and I think it was a little bit underestimated in Warner's slides, for consumers, energy efficiency is the no-brainer. Investing into more energy efficient products, but certainly also buildings, is certainly something that is a triple win. It's good for the climate, it's good for public health, and it's good for the consumer's wallet, because the energy bill is going to go down. And to make it very shortly, what I would like to say here is that we really hope that the renovation wave that is being rolled out will allow also for funding to trickle down, to allow people to retrofit the buildings, either if they own them or if they live in them. And this is really something that is very important for us in terms of a consumer-friendly energy transition. Now, when it comes more to the topic of renewable gas, what I would like to say here is that people, consumers, households need clarity and consistency of the policymakers. In fact, you really need a critical mass of consumers to take up this new type of energy solution quickly. That means that you need to nudge them into that direction. For that, you need to raise their awareness. Many people don't even know that it exists and that you have alternatives. You need also to provide clear directions. And what we see there is that, people don't change, for example, their heating appliance every 2 years. They have an average lifespan between 15 and 20 years. So that means that people need to be able to plan, or if they cannot replace them, as it has been said by Warner, then they need to be retrofitted. And there you have really the elephant in the room. Who's going to pay for that retrofit? Warner said it's not expensive. Well, maybe the little device is not expensive, but the installer who comes with it might be expensive and might not necessarily be trustworthy. So you have to really create for the consumer an environment where he can trust the advice that is being given to them and the solution that is being offered to them. And where possible, if you have the possibilities to develop alternative or creative business models to make this option to retrofit quickly affordable and attractive for the consumer, that's certainly one of the best ways forward. And if you don't have it, then you might need, if you want to push consumers quickly into that direction, you might need public funding to subsidize this type of changes. Also, what is very important is consistency of the policy. I'm from Belgium. I am one of the victims of inconsistent solar panel policy. So this is when people get mixed messages, they are going to refrain from taking a step that is bold for them, and so they need a recomforting environment. And then a last point I would like to make is maybe also, because it's only short, I would like to speak much more, but let's be disciplined. When you have alternative offers, now let's say we would, as consumers, be receiving alternative offers with renewable gas, it is very important that those offers are clear in what they offer to people. Well, I said it yesterday on Twitter in teasing about this webinar. You should not, as a consumer, need to have a PhD in organic chemistry to know what of those renewable solutions is the best for you. You know, all these rainbow colors of hydrogen, gray, green, blue, this is something that doesn't help consumers. It must be very clear in the offer that is made to them, what that means for them and what that means for the environment. So if that clarity is granted, and it's of course trustworthy, not misleading, not greenwashing, if I can say so, then it's something that will certainly help consumers take those decisions. So maybe in a nutshell, consumers are ready to engage in the energy transition, but in order to go from attitude to action, you need two things. First of all, a trusted environment, clear advice, clarity, and consistency in decision making, and a supportive environment, meaning that either you provide alternative business models or, let's say, offers also green finance that make it affordable for consumers to make that step, or you provide public funding or subsidies in order to help them to afford to be participants and positive actors in this energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monique. Again, I think very clear, and certainly also a challenge to policymakers. As you say, we need clarity, consistency, and as Augustine said at the start, that means also defining what kind of hydrogen we want, which is one part of it, and then communicating that in a way that consumers understand what the option is once it's on the table alongside potential alternatives. Thank you very much for that. Let's move on then to our next speaker is here from Siemens Energy, Benedict Herkes, Head of Government Affairs, has been with Siemens for 4 years, the last 4 years or so, and as I say, is today heading up Government Affairs for the newly formed Siemens Energy. And we turn back now, I guess, to industry in a way, but curious to hear from your perspective how you see the hydrogen market evolving, maybe also the famous blue to green transition, and the kind of equipment that's one of the things that you make is also turbines, and how happy are turbines with an evolving mix of gas to hydrogen, pure hydrogen, etc.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And maybe I start quickly. I think the key objective with the sector integration that we have, and that Augustine mentioned earlier, is really to reduce the primary fossil energy. And we will put in the middle of our energy system wind and solar energy. And hence the power system will be at the center of our entire energy system. And this makes the energy conversion into hydrogen and derived gases so important. It's important to transport it, because if we have all the offshore wind in the North Sea, we're not going to have grids only to get the energy to the consumption centers. We will need to store the energy. Storage will be more important, and there we have the gas grid, which is a fantastic storage opportunity already, and then obviously also to allow every sector to use it, the energy. And if we think this now a bit outside the context of the sector integration, I think what is really important is to understand that this hydrogen is a fantastic opportunity, not only for the climate, but also really for our industrial base, right? The ambition that we need to have for the hydrogen, and I think this is also goes beyond the studies and plans and roadmaps, the ambitions that we need to have is to build a new industry that serves global markets, that creates new jobs, that sustains also existing jobs or helps them to evolve, and that also delivers sufficient volumes of decarbonized renewable energy for climate neutrality. If I now look only at Siemens Energy, so the new company that we will have in September, there the opportunity of hydrogen is already massive. I have colleagues in Germany and in Austria. They will build the transformers, the grid connections to connect the electrolyzer to the offshore wind or to solar and to the grid. I have colleagues from oil and gas business. They are reinvesting 4% of their returns in R&D, in innovation for large-scale hydrogen compressors, for CCS technologies, for pyrolysis, etc. And my power generation colleagues in Mülheim, in Berlin, in Eastern Germany, in Sweden, they are doing their best to increase the hydrogen readiness of the turbine. So we can now already today deliver across the portfolio a co-firing of 30%, but we want to go up to 100% in 2030. And also we can already deal with changing plans from with hydrogen as long there is no big jump. If there's a big jump, then there are also technological options, but they are a bit more expensive. But right now, it's not a problem if there are changes. And then obviously my electrolyzer colleagues, so what's often meant the heart of this hydrogen story, they had last week a discussion with the German Ministry of the Environment and committed, we are going to build a gigawatt factory for electrolyzers if we get a sustainable market for hydrogen. And then also even in Siemens Gamesa, where our colleagues in Germany, in Spain, in the UK, in France, they have all an opportunity with hydrogen because hydrogen will become a main driver for renewable energy and for decarbonized gases as well. So there is really a lot into it. And if I go outside Siemens Energy, and Andreas mentioned the industrial off-takers that need to adapt their entire production processes. If I think about CCS, the infrastructure side, harbors, water treatment, CO2 synthesis, I mean, hydrogen is really an industrial growth program. And speaking of industrial growth program, the Commission last week published the recovery program with 750 billion. And here, a clear focus on the green transition. So I think it's really important that the member states can now rally behind this program and that they spend a relevant part of that money in energy infrastructure. I think we need to build now first industrial scale pilot plants for electrolysis, for CCS, for electrolysis 3-digit megawatt range, to show that the technology works, that we can deliver. We need to invest in the hydrogen infrastructure and also in upgrading the gas grid. And we also need to invest massively in renewable energy. And by investing in renewable energy, not only here in Europe, but also globally, because the best spots for wind and solar energy are not all here in Europe. In South America, for example, we can produce onshore wind for 1.7 euro cents per kilowatt hour. That's 6,000 full load hours of onshore wind. In Germany, we get 2,500 hours in the better locations. So this is really important. It needs to be a part of our development policy. It needs to be part of our external spending policy, that we make sure that we get also into these regions where we have the good conditions. And then most importantly, and Andreas mentioned this as well, is we need to adapt the regulatory framework. Switching from fossil to carbon neutral energy needs to become a business case. Needs to become a business case for every energy consuming sector. And regulation needs to focus on creating price parity with fossil energy. So if you ask me, Sonia, about the market development for hydrogen, blue, green, I think the key message is really, we need to put up our sleeves now and get things done. We need to go into the action mode, and we should stop discussing whether we should have only green hydrogen or only blue hydrogen or pink hydrogen. And we should also stop discussing to which sectors we want to limit the hydrogen, right? Should only be in this sector, but definitely e-fuel should not be in the transport sector, or it should be limited only to the hard to abate sectors. I think we need to go really all in, and we should also stop inventing criteria that make it more difficult for electrolyzers to take electricity from the grid. So I think it's really important, if you want to build an industry for hydrogen, for decarbonized gases, or for e-fuels, we have to stop being with one foot on the brake, and we need to get things running. So that would be my key message. It's really time to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's very clear. So you still, your perception is we want it, but on the other hand, we're introducing already conditions saying, well, maybe we should limit, maybe we should have incentives for this particular sector, but not that one. We want this kind of hydrogen, maybe not that one. And appreciating we need, I guess you would agree, we need clarity, as Monique also just said. but we need to go for the full breadth insofar as possible, the full breadth of options and full speed ahead. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. We turn then to a specific industrial sector with Mr. Renaud Battier, Director General at Ceramuni, so representing European ceramics industry for more than 10 years now. And this is a sector obviously also looking to decarbonize. So interesting to hear from you. We just heard, well, all lights, everything full speed ahead, all lights on green, let's go. How important is hydrogen, or has hydrogen become in your own plans for decarbonizing ceramics? Is it the new must-have?
So thank you very much, Sonia. You can hear me, I guess. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us. Ceramics are really a big consumer of natural gas, and this discussion is extremely important for us. The question that you're asking is really the question of decarbonization, and hydrogen is part of the answer. And the decarbonization in the ceramic industry, our roadmap, really reflects the heterogeneity of the sector. So there is not one answer that will be the big message, and I will explain in more details. So the ceramic sector represents 30 billion euros of turnover and 200,000 jobs, with 80% of SMEs. So we are extremely heterogeneous also in terms of companies, different images in different setups also at national level. And for people who don't know us, it's construction ceramics, it's refractory ceramics you have in steel furnaces. 50% of the market for refractory ceramics is steel furnaces, so all the insulating part in the kilns. We have technical ceramics in aerospace, in electronic batteries, cars, and then we have people know us mainly from tableware, but it's one of our sectors. So what is in common between these sectors, in fact, is the natural gas. The most important common characteristic between these sectors is natural gas, and energy represents 35% of our production cost, and natural gas 80% of our mix on average, with some differences from one sector to the other. And in the 80s, this is also one characteristic, is that we made a transition for good reasons. So before talking about the transition, I also want to highlight why natural gas has been good to us. So in the 80s, we moved from solid fuel, from coal, entirely to natural gas. So this has been to reduce CO2 emissions, but also for questions of competitiveness, in order to compete at international level, to have a clean and very stable fuel, because our kilns are working 7 days a week, 40 hours a day, and they really need this stability in order to have the maximum efficiency and productivity. Otherwise, we would not compete at the international level. And this natural gas has enabled us also to have a very low carbon footprint in comparison, for example, with producers in China who use for the same products mainly the coal gas and coal. So without natural gas, we would not be market leaders in our sectors. We would not be export champions as we are. It doesn't mean that we are not green and that we are not working intensively for decarbonization and also researching on hydrogen. We published in 2012 our carbon roadmap to 2050, and which is showing that we can reduce by 68% based on some breakthrough technologies and a lot of energy efficiency technologies, and also raw materials improvement, also the decarbonization of electricity, otherwise it would not work. There is also a scenario which shows 80% reduction, but it's with electrifying our kilns. And there is also no business model, as it has been mentioned earlier. In this context, in the context of the climate neutrality objective now, the new and more ambitious decarbonization objective for 2050, we have to revisit this roadmap. So this is what we are doing currently. And we are taking into account some technologies that we were not taking into account in 2012, primarily hydrogen, so any blending of natural gas together with hydrogen, for example, use of methane and so on. But it's not the only technologies. We will never achieve carbon neutrality just with one technology. So hydrogen today can be done in some of our processes. Many of our processes can be mixed up to 10% before we start having problems with the kilns and with the burners. So their research and innovation is really essential if we want to go beyond this obstacle. As I said, we can also use methane produced from hydrogen, but then it's a question of the business model. Combined heat and power has been extremely important for us. I'm happy to hear it today, and I have to say that currently, unfortunately, for us, the schemes and mainly the emission trading system and the way the benchmarks are being updated do not favor cogeneration. So this is something which is great for us in the ceramic industry, but we don't see any incentive or any push today, on the contrary. Then some new technologies replacing natural gas, so hydrogen, but also some technologies that will depend on electricity, including microwave, so mixing of technologies. You have microwave assisted gas firing, industrial heat pumps. All of these will also help us to achieve the target. Then biogas and biomass, but this is where we have the biggest problems because of availability in our sector. And in some regions where we have massive clusters of hundreds of companies in the same area, it's even forbidden in practice to use biomass because of the air quality. CCS, we will only benefit if there is a big cement or steel plant next to us, to simplify. And then, yes, circular economy, it has been mentioned today, it will be also essential for us, and the energy efficiency gains that we have in the life cycle. So all this will be important, but maybe in terms of research and innovation, hydrogen is where we have to really invest and where there can be some gains. All of this will only be possible if the EU is providing some stable regulatory framework, so not changing the target for 2030 every 3 years. If we have compensation both for direct emissions and for the electrification part, so for the indirect emissions part. And there I am referring to the ETS stated guidelines. And I'm mentioning these 2 points because currently, in the way the benchmarks are being updated to decide how much fair allocations we will receive in 2030, too much room is given and importance is given to biomass, while we have very limited access to biomass. And on the other hand, natural gas for us for the next 10 years will remain probably the most efficient in terms of CO2 and in terms of availability before we have these breakthrough technologies and allowing us to use much more hydrogen. And for the ETS stated guidelines, it's the same story. We need to invest massively in these microwave assisted gas firing, for example, or in industrial heat pumps. And for this, we need the stability. And for this, we need also compensation from indirect costs for the next 10 years. So looking at the study that was presented at the beginning, I think really our industry matches this vision and this approach and this analysis because we really need all these different technologies and these different fuels. We must study on how decarbonizing the natural gas with blending of hydrogen, hybridizing thermal machines, or using also gas in fuel cells. So we will continue using gas, of course, and hopefully it will be decarbonized. Thank you. I hope it answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think a very interesting perspective. So for you, nice to hear that the comparison with back in 2012 when hydrogen wasn't really on the radar yet. Now it is a part of the roadmap for 2050 going forward. And I think you clearly said it's one of many options. So you like the study, it shows the potential of this new option, but it's important to remember it's not the only option also within industry for decarbonization. So it will have its place amongst others. And I think you had a long list of policy needs, everything. I think pointing out the ETS and so on, what needs to happen on a policy front to enable the decarbonization of industry in a broader sense and make sure that there is still a viable industry in Europe at the end of the day. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have 2 panelists left then, and I've seen some more questions come in, so thank you for those. We can, feel free to send in more. We turn then to Esther Buscher from Liquid Gas Europe. So that's the European LPG Association. She's president. there at the moment. She's also head of group public affairs at SHV Energy, which is a company in the LPG, and I should add bio-LPG space. So looking forward to hearing from you I guess the link between, well, we're talking decarbonized renewable gas, bio-LPG, so the role of a clean gaseous carrier in off-grid and rural areas, which is something we perhaps hear less about, but certainly seems relevant. You can tell us how important it is, and seems relevant from my perspective, I would say also in the context of the just transition, which we hear more and more about today. So go ahead, Esther.
Thank you, Sonia. Absolutely happy to do that. I'll try to make a bridge between what you've heard from some of the longer term visions, the industry perspective, and the consumers. Try to bridge that from the off-grid rural perspective, admittedly. So the answer to today's questions is decarbonized and renewable gas needed for industries and consumers towards 2050? Well, the answer is yes, especially taking into account the needed rural recovery, where sectors like tourism and local manufacturing have been hit hard, and citizens are also more prone to energy poverty. And allow me to start with the decarbonized and renewable part of that question on this slide, indeed. LPG and bio-LPG are one of the few cost-effective solutions immediately available to heat off-grid homes and businesses, which clean the air in Europe's countryside today. It's a low-hanging fruit, as switching to LPG from liquid and solid energy sources can immediately reduce rural households and local business CO2 emissions. Because low-income households in rural areas are often forced to rely on high-polluting energy sources like heating oil and coal. And addressing the specificities of rural homes and heating, the Commission should consider supporting a mix of technologies to facilitate deep and future-proof decarbonization of heat, as electrification implies a high investment burden for consumers. And in rural areas where people are more likely to be living in poverty and in older houses, this really is an important factor. It also has a renewable future, because bio-LPG is a flexible drop-in fuel, making the seamless switch to renewable heating sources possible, without adjustments to piping or appliances for homeowners. So no PhD needed for consumers, as Monique just said, as LPG and bio-LPG are chemically identical. And as an industry, we're determined for European LPG demand to be fully satisfied by a renewable or non-fossil alternative by 2050. And bio-LPG is already available in small but increasing volumes. To give you an example, Sky Energy, SHV Energy, and KLM are partnering to launch Europe's first sustainable aviation fuel plant in the Netherlands. And this facility will be running on green hydrogen and using regional waste and residue streams as feedstocks. And it will deliver bio-LPG as a byproduct. So that is our version of smart sector integration, teaming up multiple hard to decarbonize sectors. So now let's move on to the next slide and focus on the consumer dimension of today's question in residential heating, because we need to make the energy transition work for everyone in Europe, including over 40 million European households in rural areas not connected to the gas grid. For them, we need to consider cost efficiency, as almost 25% of people in rural areas are at risk of poverty or social inclusion. Therefore, the newly refurbished houses need to be affordable and reduce cost links to energy consumption in the future. So what can policymakers do to ensure that decarbonization does not leave anyone behind? Or as Monique van Beuk just put it, who's paying for the retrofits? Well, member states could offer homeowners incentives to invest in the replacement of their inefficient heating systems with new LPG condensing boilers and hybrid installations where appropriate. And in due course, bio-LPG can be added to that mix. And the Commission could improve the information sharing and learning opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises. And this could take the form of national platforms for best practice sharing amongst installers. Because in its long-term climate strategy, as Augustijn said in the beginning, the Commission recognized the specificities for off-grid heating, where there are a limited number of sources and the optimal heating option is determined by local circumstances. But in all scenarios, coal and oil are phased out in buildings. LPG is mainly used for space and water heating and cooking. And in off-grid areas where natural gas is not available, 45% of rural heat actually comes from heating oil and coal. And replacing a traditional oil-fired or solid fuel boiler with a modern one instantly reduces air pollutant by up to 99% and CO2 emissions by up to 50%. And adding emissions reduction can be achieved by installing gas heat pumps, micro CHP, or fuel cells. For example, here you see in Germany, where there are around 1.9 million single-family homes not connected to the gas grid, and 25% of rural homes use heating oil. And on the right is another example, yet in a different climate zone in Spain, where 27% of single-family homes use heating oil. And this analysis shows the potential impact of switching to a hybrid combination of solar thermal and a new LPG boiler at first, but supplied with bio-LPG later on. So now move to the next slide, where we're touching upon the industry's needs and our role to support business in the energy transition. Because the industrial sector uses LPG as a fuel for process heating in combined heat and power systems. And it's characterized by highly controllable temperatures, negligible NOx, SOx, and particulate matter emissions. Briefly, 2 examples. In France, dairy products are the second largest agri-food industry after meat. In cheese production, many of the processes use fuels like oil currently to perform mid-temperature requirements for pasteurization and low temperature for cheese treatment. So therefore, here you see a typical cheese producer in France could benefit from switching oil consumption to LPG and bio-LPG. Another example in Italy, where over 84% of agritourism farms are located in mountain and hill areas. Many are not connected to the gas grid and therefore rely on oil or biomass for heating. For small businesses such as farmers who partially convert their homes into B&Bs or hostels, it makes sense to switch to LPG for heating and hot water. And here's an example of a typical agriturismo with around 10 rooms, reducing its energy consumption and its emission. So that's why LPG and bio-LPG are an efficient, effective, and environmentally friendly energy source for businesses and industry off the grid. And now finally, just looking at my fellow panelists today, I'd like to pose the question of how can the industry ensure that the investments in R&D projects makes the most out of the resources? From our side, bio-LPG actually is a byproduct of various processes. And technologies such as power to gas, anaerobic digestion, gasification, or pyrolysis can be optimized to purify and separate bio-LPG from the side stream gases. And maybe to make a last bridge to the next speaker, even when using captured CO2 to produce synthetic methane, one can also yield synthetic LPG. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Esther, for introducing. I think we've already had a whole long line of speakers, but nonetheless, an original dimension to the discussion, and emphasizing the particular situation of rural businesses and households, what they currently use, the fact that LPG and bio-LPG provides an affordable, fast alternative for them to move forward towards decarbonization. I think the energy poverty dimension is one that we haven't heard about until now, so valuable to introduce that. And also mentioning where bio-LPG could come from, the fact that it's something that is already in small quantities, but something already available today. Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. Our final panelist then, last but certainly not least, is Anastasios Perimenis, who's here as acting Secretary General for CO2 Value Europe. So this is an organization arguing for the use of CO2, turning it into something valuable. We had a question at the start already over why the study doesn't look so far as power to gas, power to liquids, looking at that next step of hydrogen conversion. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you what you see as the potential role and value of CCU in Europe, and how you view the study so far. Go ahead.
Yes, hello Sonia. Thanks for having us here today. For those who don't know CO2 Value Europe, we are the sector association that represent the CCU community, and we're working on the deployment at a larger scale of CCU technologies for climate mitigation reasons, but also for providing an alternative source of carbon feedstock for almost all, let's say nearly all products that we're using in our daily lives. Indeed, the study from Eurogas is very interesting. It didn't touch upon the let's say gaseous CCU fuels, and this is what I would like to open up, let's say, the door on that today, without taking too much of your time. My fellow colleagues before did I did hear here and there sometimes the word e-fuels. Warner also said it. Benedict also said it. It's, let's say, it's another option. CCU, gaseous fuels and liquid fuels, in our case, are CO2 based fuels. So captured CO2 with renewable energy transformed into hydrogen, so renewable hydrogen, and captured CO2, be it from point sources or from atmospheric CO2, depending on, let's say, on the time scale that we are running through, can produce, in the case of gaseous fuels, what we call as e-gas or e-methane or CO2 based methane. You can see it in different ways. And the advantage of it is, first of all, that it's a circular approach. So we're taking CO2, which is an emission, something that we're trying to avoid, and we use it into producing something that can be used to defossilize the hard to abate, energy intensive industries, the domestic sector, but also the transport sector. And expanding to liquid CCU fuels also provides a solution to sectors that don't have a scalable, sustainable alternative, like electrification or hydrogen. And I'm talking about sustainable aviation fuels, for example, or the maritime fuels. And Andreas said it before also, and he pointed out it is very important to promote the circular approach. And this is exactly what CO2 reuse is offering, the carbon circular economy. And if this is, let's say, done at large scale, we can envision a future where we reuse our emissions to produce products that we will use in our daily life, and then their emissions will be again reused, and it's a loop, and it can it's a real circular concept, and it can provide climate mitigation. It can provide, let's say, it can contribute to the goals of climate neutrality, as are set by the ambitious goals of the European Commission, and it can even lead to negative emissions if we're talking, for example, for direct air capture, atmospheric CO2 capture, leading to mineralization products for the construction sector, for example, where CO2 is mineralized in a permanent form. These kind of concepts facilitate the energy transition, and as I said before, we're not really talking about decarbonization at CO2 Value Europe, because we're still using the CO2 from the carbon from CO2. What we're talking about is defossilization, and at the end, this is where the trend is going, leaving fossil resources in the ground and making a transition to a renewable energy system. This is how CCU fuels can contribute, by facilitating this energy transition. Indeed, CCU technologies require renewable energy, but at the same time, they facilitate this transition by integrating more renewable energy into the energy systems, and making it also transportable. And this is also something that Benedict pointed out. So there are many, let's say, projects ongoing. I can mention two of them: the Jupiter 1000 in France, and the Store and Go European project with 3 demo plants in Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, which shows the technical feasibility of e-methane. Of course, the CCU industry is a rather nascent industry, so indeed we need to find a business case for those technologies in order to make them cost competitive, and for that my colleagues have touched upon the policy framework and the need for a regulatory solutions. What I would like to point out is that this is part now of the whole policy framework. It will be part. CCU technologies are part of this smart energy system integration, as Mr. Van Hasteren said. They will hopefully be part of the hydrogen strategy, because we're talking about the whole value chain of hydrogen, so hydrogen-based products also in line. They're part of the set plan as one of the priority actions. And to go back to the study, complementary to the scenario of a 2050 sector, power sector that uses a lot of CCS, as Werner showed in his slides, we're also involved in a study that is taking the inverse, more or less, and seeing for a 100% renewable energy, 100 renewable world, what could the power fuels role be in there? And this is in cooperation with the German Energy Agency and the Lappeenranta University of Technology in Finland. The results will come out end of June, and that would be interesting also to see how, let's say, the inverse of what Werner presented would be. Yeah, and with that, thank you for your time, and happy to be part of the discussion or the questions, to answer any questions, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anastasios, and again for introducing indeed an original dimension to the debate, which we had touched on earlier, but I think explaining how what CCU is as opposed to CCS, which obviously gets a lot of attention in the study, how the two are complementary and how different, and the potential you see for that also to play a part in decarbonizing the wider economy. Well, we're at 11 o'clock. I propose we take a couple of the questions that have come in. Some of them cover a little bit similar ground to what we had covered earlier already. And I will hand over to James Watson from Eurogas to wrap up in a moment. One question maybe which would be interesting to take to, this will go to Andreas, I think, and a question that touches on a few of the contributions. It's from Martin Ruck. And Andreas, you highlighted that the challenge for hydrogen production, one of the challenges is producing electricity at scale. And the question is, well, you know, also coming back to Benedict's intervention, is there a risk that at this point that we give hydrogen too much attention? Okay, it's needed, but as Benedict said, you know, we really need to be making sure that we go for it across all sectors. Is there a risk of giving it too much attention, that there's then a penalty, and that we end up over relying on hydrogen, and for example, electricity production, it requires an underfinancing other potentially viable options for bringing down emissions in other sectors? And it reminds me a little bit, coming back to Werner's starting point, where he said one of the key differences between the original 1.5 tech scenario and the one that DNVGL modeled for Eurogas is that the original 1.5 tech scenario is much more focused on decarbonizing within sectors, whereas the alternative scenario is looking more at sectors helping one another out. So there is a fundamental difference, it would seem, in approach and vision of how we go forward. Would you give a quick comment on that?
Yeah, I'll make it very brief. I mean, I think that there is very little risk in the sense that we are still a far way off to produce hydrogen at the scale that he suggests with his question, and it is a no regret measure to get a hydrogen industry off the ground, because we will be needing it at scale in future, full stop. The question then becomes, if we look out very far into the future, what is the relative share of hydrogen versus direct electrification? And there you can ask that question. But for me, fundamentally, if we know we need to get this technology off the ground and scaled, and we need to get it cost competitive, and we know that the amounts that we can produce prior to 2040 are no regret, then for me it's a no regret industrial strategy. But again, that long-term discussion, that's another one that one can have. And to say that we should only focus on direct electrification for me would be abdicating our responsibility to actually try for climate neutrality.
Okay, so it's potentially an issue, but much further down the line. It's not an immediate risk. Two questions, and maybe to put to Augustijn, and well, to give you a quick chance at least to respond to what we've heard so far. One was from Andrea Di Massi. Augustijn, you mentioned it, and a few other people picked up on it. What do you mean when you say make the energy system more circular? What does that mean exactly for you? And a second question from William Powell at Natural Gas World about price parity creation with fossil fuels and zero carbon. Is that something that is going to be, one, acceptable, and two, actually desirable? Augustijn, are you still there? Yeah, if you could.
Yes, I am.
We'll let you go in a sec then.
First of all, what I thought, let's continue a little bit on the previous comment very briefly, because I very much agree with that. It's that it is true that I think there is a moment now to act, but of course there's also uncertainty, and it means that we have to act on those things which we know, and those relate to the lack of alternatives in particular due to transportation, maritime industry, certain industrial implications to use hydrogen. Of course, I can imagine pathways where hydrogen is used elsewhere, but these will come into the picture at a later stage, and we will see at that moment in time whether it's a viable option. What is important though is to make sure that that consumers and users can actually make informed and well-based decisions in order to decide whether or not to use hydrogen and when. And that means that we have to think in the direction of having a market and price signals which are viable guidance for consumers to act upon. So that is one thing. On the other question, when it comes to circular economy, I think you have to think about the fact that in many sectors, for instance, there's waste heat, which can be redeployed elsewhere. Let's say if you use cooling and you use a heat pump, you also produce for that you also produce heat, and instead of venting it off in the air, maybe we should do something else with it. I think there are synergies there which we can exploit more and better in order to make the overall energy system more efficient. And I must honestly admit that I forgot the second question.
It was a question about price parity between fossil fuels and zero carbon solutions like hydrogen. Is that something acceptable and desirable from the Commission's perspective?
Well, evidently, I mentioned already just a few seconds ago that we have to have reliable price signals, and that really means that we have to make 100% certain that the emissions are properly priced in, and that we have also a pricing towards final consumers, which includes, of course, the non-energy costs, and therefore taxes and duties are really important, which push in the right direction.
And Sonja, if I can add on this, on the price parity, I think the price parity is absolutely essential because we will need sustainable markets for it, and this begins with the off-takers. And if I give one example, for e-fuels, we already have price parity. We can produce carbon neutral fuels based on renewable energies in South America, bring it to Europe. There we can be competitive. The only reason why it's not working is because the e-fuels are not recognized. But here the legislation that creates price parity is already in place. So we could kick it off immediately and go for it. But it's just the regulatory framework that closes this option. And this despite the fact that we know with 250 million passenger cars on the roads and 12 million newly registered cars each year, we will not get to carbon neutrality by 2050 by only looking at the vehicles. We need to look at the fuels as well. And there, the business case is there. Even for steel, with the eco-innovations that we have, the tool of eco-innovation that allows vehicle manufacturers to account CO2 reductions that are not in the test cycle, right? This tool already creates price parity as well for green steel in a limited scope, but it creates it. So we just, you know, we have some good options that are very close to the market, but we need just to get this done.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We have more questions. I realize it's 11, however, so I think I'm going to hand over to James in a second to wrap up. The questions, there was another question, I think, which we tried to address earlier, again, coming back to CCS and the problems of public acceptance around it. And another question too around where hydrogen use is going to make sense. At what point, what would make it an interesting option for power generation? So again, these are issues I think we already touched on. There was also a question from one delegate on a copy of the recording and presentations. So the webinar recording will be made available on the Eurogas website as soon as possible. And Esther Buscher's presentation will also be made available. However, for Warner's presentation and indeed the full results of the study, you are going to have to wait till the end of the month. The study in full will be launched on the 30th of June with another online event at 9:30 in the morning. So that will be your opportunity to get your hands on should I say, a lasting copy. And to hear some more detail on the full results. Then, James, there were a couple of questions which are perhaps best addressed to you as part of your closing comments around what all this means for the gas system. Questions around, for example, how ready is the gas infrastructure to handle decarbonized and renewable gas? What kind of adaptation would be needed? And a few questions too around blending. To what extent does the study consider blending? Would hydrogen being blended with biomethane, for example? And questions over how desirable is blending? Is hydrogen not a very clean, valuable product? And wouldn't you be diminishing also its climate value if you're mixing it in with natural gas? So a couple of questions around that. With that, go ahead.
Thank you, Sonia. I want to say, first of all, it's been a great debate this morning. Really enjoyed it. Some really good points of view. And thanks to Varna for presenting the preliminary findings of the DNVGL study. Indeed, I think that in response to some of your questions, Sonia, it's very clear that we are indeed in a position able to blend at the moment hydrogen into the existing natural gas infrastructure. Indeed, I think it was mentioned that there's a possibility to go up to about 20%. I think that was what Benedict from Siemens mentioned with most of the existing infrastructure today. So yes, we will need to adapt as we go forward, as we see higher volumes of hydrogen being blended in. But Varna did a pretty good job of explaining that they've looked at that in their study, and they factored in the cost of what would need to be done to upgrade the gas system to cope with higher volumes of hydrogen as it goes forward. And also looking at consumer uses, sort of boilers, looking at industrial uses, looking at power uses, so turbines. All of those things have been factored in, and I think it's very important to say that those are all technologies we have today. I've seen CCGT being started, indeed it was a Siemens CCGT, I'm happy to tell you, Benedict, being started that can carry 30% hydrogen today. That's in the field in Berlin. So I believe that it's not a question of a huge amount of cost. It is a question about upgrading. It's a question about bringing forward and deploying those technologies. Benedict again was rolling up his sleeves. I think this is a good kind of image to have. We need to roll up our sleeves and fully agree with that. So yes, we can blend. And no, I fully disagree with the idea that putting hydrogen together with natural gas is a bad idea. It's a bad idea if you're a fundamentalist. If you actually want to achieve carbon neutrality, you need to use all the tools that are available. That means that you have to make difficult choices and take a different stand and just say, oh, hydrogen's a premium product, so we can't use it in this way. Well, that's a wrong approach, because really what we have to say is we have to take the approach that we need to use the technologies we have to achieve carbon neutrality. And I would say, to take Monique's point of view, we have to make sure we bring our consumers, we bring society with us. And I would take my point of view and say, that means we need to make it as affordable as possible. And actually using hydrogen, using different methods to achieve carbon neutrality will be crucial to bringing people with us. And I think that it would be a mistake to try and write one thing off and say, I can't use hydrogen for this and you can't use hydrogen for that. If you go back to the 1960s, and I will, hydrogen was more prevalent than methane in many cities. It wasn't considered a premium product. So if we actually can imagine that in the past, we used to have a very high penetration of hydrogen that was used for many things, including street lighting. It's not a question of having it as a premium product. In the future, it could be as ubiquitous as methane is today, and that's only in 30 years. So I think we just have to get this sort of idea that we are going in a transition, and what you consider to be premium today will be ubiquitous tomorrow. Solar energy, solar electricity, wind electricity were definitely premium products 15 years ago. They are becoming more ubiquitous today. So let's start thinking in the correct way about this transition, this journey that we have to go on. I would say briefly, and moving from those questions, to say thank you to all of the panelists. Very nice comments that came in, I think, looking at all of the different options. I will synthesize by saying it's very clear that you need energy efficiency. Monique made this clear, and that's important for consumers. And I do believe that both the scenarios that were modeled by Varna started from a standpoint of a very, very high amount of energy efficiency, up to around 30% in both scenarios from 2017, not 1990. From 2017, an extra 30% will be needed by 2050. So this is a big undertaking. We will definitely need renewable electricity. Many questions about this, but it's clear in the study's preliminary findings that there will be a core of renewable electricity in the energy system. Renewable electricity is not a synonym with electrification, which is another thing which I think we have to be clear. Renewable energy, and renewable electricity in particular, is an important part of electricity, and we need to make sure we deploy more of it. If we deploy more of it, we'll have more hydrogen for the gas system and do more of the sector integration that Augustine has mentioned. And so I think that these are the things that we have to remember. When we're talking about electrification, we should be talking about deployment of renewable electricity, because that's what we really want. And our study, DMV and I've put forward, shows that power is actually very, very heavily renewableized, indeed using biomethane and biomass. Now, the negative emissions are really delivered by applying CCS to those biomass and biomethane plants, so that you actually are capturing and creating a negative emission scenario. Renaud is very good at pointing out that industry needs all options, and so I would say that this is one of the main messages we can take from today. It is an and scenario. We will need hydrogen, we will need renewable electricity, we will need biomass, we will need liquid fuels, we will need CCU, we will need CCS. All of these things will be needed to achieve the objectives that we've set ourselves for 2050, and we need to make sure we make the right pathway to get there. Many of the panelists have talked about the regulatory framework. We need to make sure that we are driving the right policy framework to make sure that these investments are made, to make sure that consumers know what they're getting. I think it was very good to have Esther on board as well to talk about rural communities who are often forgotten about. And I think that it's really important that we also look at what decarbonised options that are affordable for them exist. And here she made a very good point that gas and LPG in this case will make a very, very good substitute for coal and oil that are still very prevalent in those kind of communities. So we shouldn't forget about all of those different elements that we've heard about today. And I would say this, thank you. Thank you to you, Sonia, for a very well-moderated event. Thank you to all the panelists for coming on. Augustine, Monique, Benedict, Andreas, Renaud, Esther, and Anastasios, all giving very good, different, yet I would say convergent views about what we need to do. And ultimately, I must thank Varna for spending the last year of his life working very hard on that study, working with us to try and find the right ways, the right way forwards to deliver the objective of carbon neutrality. And I think there aren't that many studies out there that are doing such a good job as Varna has done, looking at all of the different options that we have. Finally, I would say a big thank you to the team in Eurogas behind this. Thanks for working so hard to deliver a great event today. And Also, I must say my final thank you, shouldn't forget, to the participants. Many of you have managed to stay all the way through. Still have over 100 of you. We had over 200 at one point. I really have to say thank you very much. Stay tuned. There'll be more Eurogas events coming. And indeed, as Sonia's already pointed out, we will have our major launch event when the study moves from preliminary findings to findings on the 30th of June. And so I hope to see most of you back with us then to see if there's been any updates, taking into account some of the feedback we've had today, and to again add another brick into the wall of knowledge that we are building to deliver on our climate change promises. Thank you, Sonia, for a great job today, and thanks everyone else for joining. There will be a recording of the event, which will be available and circulated to all of you soon. As I say, I wish you all a very good day, and let's take Siemens Energy, Benedict's words, roll up our sleeves and get to the business of deploying. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day and see you on the 30th of June, if not before. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.